Welcome to the Rabbi Show. The Rabbi Show. Now you can connect with your own personal rabbi. Rabbi Yitzwine from the Young Israel Aish of Las Vegas is here at 257 KDWN.
Good morning, not Rabbi Wine with you this morning with Peter Dabowski. I'm not a rabbi, but I play one on the radio. And I'm not a boy. I'm a man, and I believe in the promised land, as does my guest, Aryeh Green, who will introduce in just one moment. And the rabbi from Brooklyn is also here this morning. We'll introduce the rabbi from Brooklyn in one moment. And first of all, let's remember this day in history. 35 years ago today, the miracle on ice when America beat the Soviet Union in the Olympic hockey game, went on to win after that the gold medal. And it's not just a hockey game. It turned the morale of the United States around. It was a time when the morale of the United States, as old-timers like me and you remember, that things were bad. The economy was bad. Things were looking down. We were ready to think that the Soviet Union, that we were not going to anyway beat them in anything. We had hostages in Iran. Wait, Iran? That Iran, yes. We had hostages in Iran being held for about a year. I've got to do the math on that one, but it's been since the revolution in 79. It's been a little while. And guess what? We won the hockey game, and we saw that redemption was near, that things can turn around just when you can lose hope. Things can turn around, and you get those signals. And with that message of hope from the Miracle on Ice 35 years ago today, let me introduce my guest. Here he is, one of my favorites, Aryeh Green, Director of Media Central, a project of honest reporting in Jerusalem, former advisor to Natan Sharansky. You guys remember the video of that Sharansky coming back from the Soviet Union? I still get tears watching that video. Anyway, we'll talk about that in a minute. High-tech business executive and consultant, and a well-known speaker and expert on Israel, the Middle East, politics, history, and the media, and thank God, a frequent visitor to Las Vegas. Aryeh Green, welcome.
Thanks, Peter. Good morning. It's very nice to be back.
Good morning. Welcome to Las Vegas.
Thank you. Had a lovely, lovely Shabbat, a lovely Sabbath here in the beautiful weather of Las Vegas, having come from Aspen, where it's snowing, and going tomorrow to New York, where it's snowing.
And you were in San Francisco, too. You're all over.
Indeed. Los Angeles before that.
Well, good. Well, what brings you to the United States this time?
Well, as always, I come to raise awareness about a number of the issues which I think are fundamental and pressing for not just the Jewish community, for all those who love Israel, Jews, Christians, and others, and for America and American interests, both in terms of how the media portrays the issues over there in Israel and the specific actual policy issues as well.
Well, let's talk about it first of all. We mentioned before you're the Director of Media Central. What is Media Central? We know they're a project of honest reporting in Jerusalem, but tell us, what is Media Central?
Well, at base, Media Central is a small project in Jerusalem, as you said, Peter, which provides services for the foreign press who are based in or visiting Israel. And those services can be anything from the most mundane, finding a carpenter, or professionally related, finding a driver, connecting them with a translator or a photographer, a tour guide, or what have you, to the most strategic, setting up interviews with the Prime Minister, with experts and analysts on all sorts of issues, even on the Palestinian side. Basically, our job is to help the journalists to go deeper into the issues, to understand the complexities of all the issues, both, of course, regarding the conflict, but even water issues, domestic Israeli cultural or political issues. Everything over there is more complicated than you think. And when they come carrying their kind of baggage of the simplistic framing of the issues, our job is to help them develop a more nuanced understanding of all the subjects that they're covering.
Good. I want to find out what a typical day is like for Aryeh Green in Jerusalem. But before we get to that, I want to know what's hot on the burner in Jerusalem and with Media Central, with what's happening with the foreign journalists, with getting the facts straight, with the headlines as they are.
Well, it's funny, Peter. I'm really glad that you asked that, because there are a few hot issues that you can imagine, and of course some of them you'll want to discuss Prime Minister Netanyahu's upcoming speech in Congress is a hot issue here in America, less so elsewhere in the world and even in Israel. Some other issues, of course, related to the elections. The coming elections in Israel are, of course, hot issues. And for me and for Media Central, how the different parties are portrayed, how the different leaders are portrayed in the foreign press, and particularly here in Israel, in America, is crucial to an understanding of how the media portrays the issues. But one of the things that's really, really hot right now is that the Associated Press just released a report supposedly analyzing the percentages of civilian casualties in the conflict, the war with Hamas, the terrorist organization there in Gaza, Israel's defensive military operations in Gaza last summer. And there's been a lot of back and forth, and our job at Media Central has been to help the journalists to really understand what's going on with those numbers. And if you'd like, I'll give you some examples of just how twisted statistics can become in the service of some agenda.
I'm interested.
Well, let's put it very simply. The AP issued this report suggesting that, according to their preliminary analysis, 66% of the casualties in the conflict this last summer were civilians. Now, I'm sure your listeners and you and anybody else immediately looks at that and says, wow, 66%, that's awful. That means that more civilians were killed than combatants. And that is what the AP analysis refers to. And it calls itself an exclusive. And it's meant to inform readers of this very, very disturbing number. And yet, the AP report does not refer to a number of crucial contextual issues here. For instance, if you take that 66% and compare it to American military operations in Iraq, or America and the UK's operations in Afghanistan, or NATO, the leading lights of the democratic world, fighting in Kosovo or in Bosnia, what you see is that Israel's percentages, which is basically a ratio of 2 to 1, 2 civilians killed for every combatant, it pales in comparison to the civilian casualties in Iraq, where the ratio is 3 to 1, or in Afghanistan, where the ratio is 4 to 1. Or in Kosovo, where the ratio goes up to 7, 8, sometimes, according to some figures, 9 to 1. What do I mean by these numbers? I mean that Israel has over both this last summer and in previous operations, Israel has killed and injured fewer civilians, not more, fewer civilians than any other Western nation carrying out military operations against terrorist groups that act within civilian populations. I just want to quote for you the former Chief of Staff of the United States of America, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who very explicitly said a short while ago, Martin Dempsey, I'm quoting, said, Israel has gone to extraordinary lengths to limit civilian casualties. And the world's leading expert on the issue of civilian casualties in war, Colonel Richard Kemp, who was the commander of the UK forces in Afghanistan, a man who's a military commander who knows about fighting in these kind of operations, has said that Israel, the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, is the most moral military force, not only in the world today, but in the history of warfare. So, just to conclude, if you take this exclusive, quote-unquote, AP report, supposedly criticizing Israel for a ratio of 2 civilians who were injured or killed, a ratio of 2 to 1 of civilians versus combatants over the summer, you can turn it on its head, according to the experts, those who understand these things. If you put a little historical context into what those numbers mean, and you recognize the AP should have had a headline saying, celebrating, championing Israel's virtually miraculous, unprecedented success in reducing civilian casualties, not criticizing or castigating Israel for this number of a 2 to 1 ratio, which supposedly, without any context, makes Israel look bad.
And I'm glad you pointed that out. And it's even especially so, given that the way they were fighting and the way the Hamas was fighting in Gaza was to have used civilians as shields, which even Secretary Kerry acknowledged. So the fact that they used that type of warfare and Israel was able to minimize civilian casualties is something to point out.
Very much so. In fact, Professor Alan Dershowitz, a law professor from Harvard, one of the leading liberal lights of the judicial community here in America has said repeatedly that Hamas carries out a double war crime as defined by the laws of war, by firing rockets from their own civilian population, putting their civilian population at risk, and storing rockets and weaponry in civilian buildings, and even using civilian residences as their headquarters and command centers. They endanger their own civilian population. And the second war crime, of course, is targeting Israel's civilian population as opposed to military installations, which, according to the laws of war, is a war crime.
Now, there's going to be a UN investigation into Gaza. I don't know how they call it. Is Gaza...
The leader of it, Shabazz, actually resigned recently, and
Yes.
there'll be a new leader appointed, of course.
Right. And George Clooney's wife, I think, is on the investigative committee.
I believe she resigned. But
She resigned?
Sure.
Well, tell us a little about what is that whole thing about? Do you happen to...
Well, at basis, let's take a look, actually, just relating your question to this AP report. The AP report uses United Nations provided figures regarding the civilian casualties over the summer's operation. Where does the UN get those figures from? The Gaza health authorities. Who controls Gaza and the Gaza health authorities? Hamas. Hamas, which for the record we all refer to, but we should recognize that that is a shortened form of their actual name, which is the Islamic Resistance Movement. Important sidelight to at least recognize. But Hamas is recognized as a terrorist organization by the United States, by Europe, by other Western nations, and the United Nations is using the numbers provided by the Hamas-controlled Gaza health authorities, which have been proven in the past, and today even by the Meir Amit Counterterrorism Center in Israel, had been proven also in their preliminary numbers to be exaggerated. They use civilian casualties. In other words, they use civilian deaths, natural deaths in a population of 1.2 million people. People die every day. Those are listed as civilian casualties of Israeli bombings. They use... They ignore the fact that Hamas fired off some 2,000 or so rockets into Gaza territory, rockets which were misfired, which didn't land as intended in Israel, but rather landed in Gaza, some of which obviously probably hit some of these houses or what have you. And the point about your question about the UN is that if the United Nations uses these numbers, the information that's been provided by a terrorist organization, to substantiate the claims of, for instance, quote, disproportionate force, unquote, which is a term used by Ban Ki-moon, the head of the UN, a number of times, the Secretary General of the UN. Again, we have to ask ourselves, what does that mean, disproportionate force? What are we comparing it to? Well, under the laws of war, Israel's use of force is absolutely proportionate, where a military operation has to be proportionate to the military benefit that's gained, as well as to not endanger more than the necessary civilian population. It doesn't mean you cannot ever injure or attack a civilian population. Unfortunately, in modern warfare, it happens all the time. And I referenced Iraq, Afghanistan, Bosnia, etc. as proof points. The problem with the UN is that they're not only using information that's provided by very interested parties, whether it's the Palestinian Authority and the Fatah party there in Judea and Samaria, in the disputed territories, otherwise known as the West Bank, which the Palestinian Authority controls some of, or whether it's figures that are provided by Hamas or other organizations, but it goes deeper than that. Ban Ki-moon and others at the UN are wedded to a concept, to a framing of the issues that basically suggests that Israel is an illegal occupier in those disputed territories, which we can talk about later, about how it's simply unsubstantiated in any understanding, accurate understanding of history and international law. They're wedded to a framing of the issue that Israel is the Goliath in this presentation of the Palestinian victims versus the Israeli oppressors. They are wedded to an understanding of Israel as a Jewish state with a religious identity, without a real appreciation for the fact that Israel is a state, the nation state of the Jewish people, that there's a national, ethnic, civilizational identity involved here. And those issues, this framing of an understanding of what's going on there in the Middle East affects, or should I say infects, the policy prescriptions not only at the UN, but European governments and elsewhere. And that's why what we do with the media is so important, because it's the media, the journalists who are reporting from the field there in Jerusalem and the areas, who dictate the terms of reference for public discourse. which is why a Ban Ki-moon can use a term like disproportionate force with regard to Israel's operation in Hamas over the summer without really understanding what the terms mean, because the media uses those terms, and European politicians and others even here in America, including some in the Jewish community, use terms like that without really understanding how absurd and manipulative those terms are and how they're simply parroting the propaganda that's being promoted by the anti-Israel groups, whether they're Arab or Muslim or European or here in America.
Let's talk about Netanyahu's speech. This is what is on the papers here in the papers here in America. It's one of the first times in a long time that Israel is become a domestic policy that is in everybody's homes, so to speak.
Everybody's talking about it.
Everyone's talking about it, and I think a lot few understand it. I confess, I don't understand it. So can you please shed some light on what the whole Netanyahu speech and the rift with the administration is?
Well, I'd like to suggest two things. First of all, let's look for 1 second at history. In 2011, the Speaker of the House, Boehner, invited the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, to speak to a joint session of Congress. The Speaker of the House notified the White House. The White House offered no objection. The visit was announced. Prime Minister Netanyahu came and spoke. He got, I think, 29 standing ovations. That's not as important, except to represent or to reflect the support for Israel that does cross the aisle within the Houses of Congress, which obviously reflects the support for Israel in both on all sides of the political spectrum that, thank God, exists here in Israel on the right and the left. What happened recently followed the same pattern. Speaker of the House, Boehner, invited the Prime Minister of Israel to speak to a joint session of Congress, notified the White House a few hours before the visit was announced. The White House offered no objection. Netanyahu publicly accepted the invitation. And then all of a sudden, whether it was President Obama himself or his subordinates in the White House or activists in the Democratic Party or groups like J Street or others, came out with a full frontal attack on Netanyahu. And when I say frontal attack, I'm saying two things. It's perfectly legitimate, Peter, for Americans debating American foreign policy and having different political agendas to have an argument as to whether or not either Obama's policy towards Iran is good or bad for America, whether it's good policy or bad policy. It's perfectly legitimate for Boehner, a Republican, to do something which is, let's call it petty politics, to invite the prime minister of a foreign country to address Congress who is going to argue against President Obama's policies as a Democrat. That's kind of politics as usual in Israel, I'd imagine. Boehner could have invited the Prime Minister of India to address the two houses of Congress. It's perfectly reasonable for people to disagree not only about Obama's policies in Iran, but about whether Netanyahu should or shouldn't have accepted the invitation. I would submit that perhaps Netanyahu should have been smarter and postponed the acceptance of the invitation if he was able to predict the political storm that erupted here in America. But the point I'm making is really twofold.
When you say postpone, though, what do you mean postpone until?
Come after the legislation on the Iran sanctions was presented and passed or failed or vetoed or not or what have you. That's what I mean.
Would that be too late? But
that's exactly the next point I was going to get to. Okay. So that one could argue that maybe he might have made a different decision. But there are two issues to make here. Number one is this whole brouhaha has erupted because of Democrats and some others on the left side of the American political spectrum who have made an issue of the Prime Minister of Israel coming and arguing against the president's policies, that somehow is interference in domestic American politics. It is not. This is not politics. This is policy. If, as I said, there's a political element to Boehner's trying to stick it to Obama, okay, that's domestic American politics, kind of politics as usual. But the policy debate over whether this agreement with Iran is good for America, good for the West, good for Israel, or whether it is dangerous and bad for Israel and bad for the West and Europe and bad for America, that's a legitimate policy debate. And for Boehner to invite anybody to address a joint session of Congress, the Prime Minister of England or the Prime Minister of Israel, is perfectly legitimate. That's the first point. The second point, which is more important in terms of the way the media is presenting things, if I have quotes from the New York Times description the political element of this invitation. I was astounded that one reference was to Netanyahu engineering the visit. We'll come back to that word, engineering the visit, and a few sentences later describing Netanyahu as maneuvering to succeed in the Israeli election. That's a very interesting turns of phrase, both of these. If Netanyahu engineered this invitation, doesn't that seem to imply that he has some nefarious influence or control over domestic American politics and agenda and Boehner and the Congress? That's getting a little bit close to the anti-Semitic themes of Jews controlling our government. A little bit close, that word engineered. It's also not factually correct. Boehner's office and Ron Dermer, Israel's ambassador in Washington, and the Prime Minister's office in Israel have all made it clear and substantiated that even with a copy of the letter of Boehner's invitation, which explicitly called it a bipartisan invitation. And both offices have acknowledged it was Boehner's idea and Boehner's invitation. So this concept that Netanyahu or our ambassador Dermer somehow manipulated the system in order to engineer, according to the New York Times, the invitation is a terribly both twisted way of presenting it, and it makes Israel and Netanyahu look bad. And then the second word, that he was maneuvering to succeed in an election, again, what does that mean? When we talk about American Congress people who are running for election, we would talk about their fight to win the election. We would talk about their campaigning. We would talk about their politicking. But maneuvering, that also sounds a little bit kind of like the sly, cunning Jew working in the back to try and make things happen. In democracies, people run for election. That's politics. I don't understand the turn of phrase of maneuvering to succeed in an election. And all of this is to demonize the Prime Minister of Israel, to make Bibi look bad. And that's one of the agendas that we see in the media today, both in Israel and reflected in American media, of making Bibi look bad for all sorts of different reasons, not least to make Obama look better because of the discord between Netanyahu and Obama.
Well, what if you said, and you said before that Netanyahu could have delayed the speech. What if he said, okay, I'll speak. I'm going to accept this invitation, but I'm going to come after was it March 17th?
March 17th is our elections. March 25th is the congressional vote on the Iran sanctions bill, okay. The Menendez.
Okay, so Netanyahu could have said, okay, after the election, this way Obama couldn't, well, I guess we don't really know that Obama did not object, our president did not object, according to what you've said, but afterwards he said, I am objecting because he's not supposed to come before his own election.
Well, there's two issues here, Peter. Number one is, no, there was no objection when the White House was initially informed. And admittedly, Boehner has admitted that he delayed informing the White House for his own purposes until the last minute. Okay, that's what he did in 2011 too. That's domestic American politics. That has nothing to do with whether or not this is Israel or anything else that's going on. But having said that, yeah, the other subtle issue is that what Barack Obama has said that is not that he's against the speech, although of course he and others have made it clear that they are against Netanyahu speaking at Congress on the Iran issue, which makes sense. If you're a supporter of Obama and if you're a supporter of his policy, of course you don't want the world's leading expert on the Iranian nuclear threat, who's the leader of the country most threatened by a potential Iranian nuke, coming and arguing against your policy. That's reasonable. But what's interesting is Obama said, I will not meet with Netanyahu because it's not done 2 weeks before his election. That makes me laugh, I have to say, as an American and an Israeli. I hold dual citizenship. I've lived in Israel for 30 years, but I am still an American at heart, grew up here. Therefore, I look at the issues from both perspectives. As an American, it makes me laugh because there are many times where American leaders have met with foreign leaders, even in the midst of an election session. And John Kerry met with the leader of the opposition, Herzog, who's the head of the Labour Party, just a week and a half ago or so, over in Europe. That didn't, because he's in an election, didn't stop him from publicly meeting with him. But the bottom line that makes me laugh as an Israeli is, and I've read 5 or 6 different pundits in Israel who relate to this issue, this speech in Congress will be detrimental to Netanyahu's electoral campaign. It will not bolster it. This argument that somehow the speech in Congress is going to bolster his campaign is absurd, because the coverage in Israel and the media after this speech in Congress will be entirely negative, because it'll be about the few senators who don't show up and the fact that Obama has chosen not to meet Netanyahu and the idea that the speech may not have an effect. But we can talk later about whether or not it's a good idea to go through with the speech. But the idea that it's for Israeli electoral considerations that Obama's refusing to meet Netanyahu, as I said, is somewhat amusing, both from an Israeli and an American perspective.
It is, and Obama pretty much revealed that himself, which we'll talk about right after this break. Again, we're here with Aryeh Green, Media Central in Jerusalem, talking about what's going on the front pages all over the world, going on with Israel. We're right back in just a few minutes right after the news. All right, we are back on the Rabbi Show. Peter Dabowski filling in for Rabbi Yitzchak Wein, who's on assignment. So they used to say that in journalism, right? On assignment.
That's right.
Which means they were hungover. No, but Rabbi Wein is not. Rabbi Wein is traveling to visit his mother in Canada, so he should have safe travels, and God willing, he'll be back next week, having seen his mother and refreshed, seeing his family up in Western Canada. When we last left off, we were talking about Obama and Netanyahu, and we're here with Aryeh Green. And Aryeh Green, my guest this hour, very special to have him here from Israel, very special to have him here in the studio for the whole hour. I get him all to myself. And the rabbi from Brooklyn is here too. And he is the director of Media Central, a project of honest reporting in Jerusalem, a former advisor to Natan Sharansky, a high-tech business executive and consultant,
etc., etc.,
and a well-known lecturer. And everybody loves him, and everyone's enjoying you on the show. So thank you for being here.
Thanks, Peter. Nice to be here.
And so we just last left off, we were talking about Obama, Netanyahu. One thing that bothers me about this is that if the president wanted to play it clean and say, let me tell you something, I would love to have Netanyahu visit. I respect him as a foreign leader. We speak all the time. We have a personal friendship behind the scenes. That kind of, if he wanted to really be classy, he could have said that, but he said, but we have a policy that with an election coming up in their foreign country in that cycle, we don't have the foreign leaders come. Okay.
Or that he won't meet with Netanyahu, which actually, fine. Even we can even accept the idea that, okay, he doesn't want to meet with the prime minister to give him the patina of the statesman, like, visiting with foreign leaders, photo op, as it were, which
right.
is fine. I can even accept that.
That's right. But what he said was when the president, our president, was meeting with Angela Merkel, they asked him the question. He says, we have a policy where we don't do it. And he says, I wouldn't do it for Angela Merkel. Now, he could have stopped right there and been classy. And then he said, but Angela Merkel wouldn't, because I don't think Angela Merkel would have even asked. And that's how he had
that was a bit of a dig.
Right, he had to twist it a little bit just to because he could have been classy and just left it
Unfortunately, that also reinforces the idea that Netanyahu asked for this or engineered it or manipulated it, or that Ron Dermer was working behind the scenes as our ambassador and in cahoots with the GOP. These are the tropes that have been repeated now ad nauseum over the last few weeks, that somehow Netanyahu is in bed with the Republicans and this is bad for Israel, etc. And in fact, I want to address that issue that you mentioned earlier, which is that is it Netanyahu's fault, and is it this visit that's driving a wedge between America and Israel? Is it this issue which is creating a new concept of Israel as a partisan issue? There are many on the left who have said Israel has always been a bipartisan issue, and this visit is turning Israel into a partisan issue for the first time. Forgive my language, but phooey.
Thank you.
There is absolutely, just objectively looking at the last 10 or 20 years of relations between Israel and America, or 30 years, there have been a number of different issues that have been raised, policy differences between the United States of America and Israel, with Republican and Democratic administrations, with right-wing and left-wing, Likud and Labor-led governments in Israel, where our interests and our goals differ very slightly. Of course, we all know that America and Israel share an incredible wealth of shared values, shared interests, shared security interests, national security interests, and the like. But occasionally our perspectives are slightly different, and not least because Israel is so much closer to the Islamic State and its developing takeover of Iraq, Syria, etc., so much closer to Iran. And Iran calls America the great Satan and Israel the little Satan. Their focus for the last decade has been on destroying the smaller, littler Satan, meaning Israel, and their rhetoric has been less directed at antipathy or hostility towards America. And so there are sometimes those differences, and this is no complete, it's blown out of proportion. And what bothers me is that if one were to say Israel is now becoming a partisan issue, the background to that and the people responsible to that are without question those on the left of the American political spectrum who have turned to an acceptance of the Palestinian propagandistic approach of blaming Israel for everything, blaming Israel for the lack of economic progress in Gaza, blaming Israel for Palestinian men beating their wives more frequently now than they used to, blaming Israel for the lack of progress in peace talks, blaming Israel for the lack of a more general regional peace arrangement. The left in America has unfortunately begun to parrot that very propagandistic approach to the issues. I'm not suggesting for a minute that there aren't reasonable criticisms to be had against Israeli policy, whether it's in the territories or our military operations against Hamas or Hezbollah or other issues. But what's happened is, and this is true at the highest levels of the Democratic Party, that from the president on down, that this framing of the issues that Israel's the bad guy in this conflict has now basically permeated the approach, whether it's to Israel's defensive military operations or its domestic policies with vis-a-vis Arab minorities or religious pluralism issues in Israel or what have you. And certainly it has affected, or as I say sometimes infected, as I said earlier, the perception of Netanyahu, who of course is the elected prime minister of Israel. So if Israel has become now more of a partisan issue, dividing Democrats and Republicans, the responsibility for that lies, I believe, on the left of the political spectrum here in America that has turned it into a more political football. But I'm pleased to say, as my final comment on this issue, that still consistently Americans support Israel across the board, Democrats and Republicans. And we'll see that, I believe, with the Prime Minister's speech in Congress, where despite all the threats of who won't show up, that he will receive a resounding amount of support from Congress, because the representatives of the American people know that the vast majority of Americans support Israel as a democracy, as a bastion of freedom in a sea of totalitarian, authoritarian regimes there in the Middle East, as a country which shares America's basic values of liberty, freedom, justice, truth, and democracy. And that's not propaganda, for the record. That's an absolutely accurate statement when you look at the history of Israel and its founding and its behavior and its policies, as well as America's, over the last 65 years.
Thank you very much. And I think you're right. And listen, it is nonpartisan, it is bipartisan that we all support Israel. The reality is, which is for another time, as it's been said, this is not your father's Democratic Party. And the things that are being said by the head of the Democratic National Commission and committee and others is not friendly. It's openly antagonistic to Netanyahu, and it shouldn't be. It really should not be. And it's so we will get to, I want to talk, by the way, since we're on the subject of these Iranian negotiations, what is going on with these negotiations, and what is this that we just heard, that Israel is being kept out, so to speak, of the negotiations? Can you please shed some light?
My sources tell me that there is great frustration in the Israeli intelligence community, and by which I'm referring both to the official intelligence branches and the government, the foreign ministry, the Prime Minister's office, and elsewhere, as well as the unofficial intelligence community. Great frustration in the lack of transparency in these negotiations. The truth is, I believe that frustration is felt around the world, not just by Israel, and it's felt by Saudi Arabia and Egypt and others in the region. And it's an irony that it's not nearly recognized enough, although I read an article just yesterday in the Wall Street Journal talking specifically based on interviews with the leaders of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and others who were involved in this conference last week, against extremism, where they have explicitly said, look, we don't want to align our policies with Israel, but we are as concerned about the development of an Iranian nuclear weapon, and we are as concerned about where these negotiations are leading. And it's fascinating to see that the other Arab countries who are supposedly allies of the United States of America are also sharing the same frustrations. And the frustration really, it boils down to two things. One is that there's no transparency. Nobody really knows what's going to be in that agreement. But the second thing is that the little that we do know that has been shared is explicitly changing the goalposts. A few years ago, President Obama, reflecting the consensus of the Western world, and obviously Israel as well, said explicitly, we will not allow Iran to gain the capability to develop nuclear weapons. Today, the goal of this administration explicitly is we want to sign an agreement that can be Obama's legacy in foreign policy, like Obamacare, like the healthcare reform was his legacy in domestic policy. In other words, their goal is an agreement. Their goal is not to prevent Iran from having the capability of developing nuclear weapons. And what the little that we do know seems to suggest that their cutoff point is that they want to ensure that it will take a year for Iran to be able to develop a nuclear weapon. In other words, you've got a breakout point, as it's known, that tipping point, which would make it impossible for them to develop a nuclear weapon in less than a year. What does that mean? That means that when President Obama is no longer president, they could have a nuclear weapon. There's an absurd cynicism to even that little aspect of the agreement that we know about, that they've changed the goalposts such that it's not to prevent Iran from having the capability to develop nuclear weapons. It's to ensure that Iran has to have a delay of a year before it can develop those nuclear weapons. That's what's frustrating to the Israeli intelligence community, and that's what's frustrating to most of the Arab world who are opposed to the Iranian fanatical jihadist Shiite mentality, and that's what's frustrating, I believe, to many of the European and other Western nations who are not involved in the P5+1 negotiations. And
frustrating for us, too, because, as you said, there was the policy of the United States not to have nuclear capability, and all of a sudden now, not to have Iranian nuclear capability, and now all of a sudden, let's just, God forbid, crack open that door just a little bit.
Yeah. Leave the door open.
That, and that's not, that is a big shift that makes us all uncomfortable. Now, when you and I were talking about the radio show, I said, you know what? It's the month of Adar on the Jewish calendar. This is the happiest month. We have the holiday of Purim, where we celebrate how we all
next week.
That's right. We all get dressed up in costume, and we celebrate that the Jewish people, through God's providence and protection, helped us and saved us from, God forbid, annihilation from the Persian king Achashverosh, right, Rabbi from Brooklyn?
Shalom. Yes, that is true.
Okay, good. And so I said, you know what? It's the month of Adar. Let's just talk about good news. And then as I was writing notes to prepare for today, I have only bad news written on all this pieces of paper. But I want to talk about some good news. It's the month of Adar. You are, thank God, an observant Jew. Tell us about Purim and your thoughts on Purim and the Jewish people from the Israel perspective.
Well, because our time is short, let's jump, as I agree with you, to the positive. In other words, I'll take 30 seconds to review the negative aspects, the concept that there is a connection between the way the Jews as a people are perceived and depicted by people like Haman, the evil character in the Purim story in the Megillah, called Megillat Esther, the story of Esther. The way that Haman portrays the Jews to Ahasuerus, the king of Persia, and convinces him that those Jews, they're different. They don't abide by our laws. They're going to be a thorn in our side. Let's get rid of them. Obviously has a tremendously disturbing, let's say not parallel, but lesson and relevance to today's world, where so many are demonizing the Jews as a people, or Israel as the state of the Jews, as the Jew among the nation, as it were, and saying that they're different, that they're bad, that they're evil, and based not on their behavior, because one can say Hitler was evil, one can say the Islamic State beheading innocent civilians or killing the Yazdis or killing Christian Copts in Libya. These people are evil. There is evil in the world. But Israel, as the state of the Jews, or as the Jew among the nations, being described and demonized as evil, as having an apartheid regime, as being oppressive or what have you, this is really reminiscent of the way Haman convinced Ahasuerus, the king, to persecute the Jews. And I would suggest in this quick comment about the negative side that the media today, many, not all of course, but many in the media today, in the way they depict Israel so much in negative terms, are playing the role of Haman to our policymakers in Europe and even here in America, convincing them that they have to come down hard on Israel, the state of the Jews, because of this perceived antipathy, or this perception, the way it's presented, that Israel is in the wrong. Let's move to the positive. Why do we celebrate Purim? We celebrate Purim because, in the end, Haman's devious, nefarious intentions are rejected. In the end, Ahasuerus, as the policymaker, as the leader of the kingdom, is made aware of the fact that the Jews are not only not as bad as Haman has depicted them, but in fact is that they are both as individuals, leaders, Mordechai, Esther, and others, very helpful, beneficial to the kingdom, but as a people, they are beneficial and helpful and certainly guiltless within the context of his wider empire. And we celebrate Purim as the success, as the wonderful historical and religious deliverance of the Jewish people from those who would destroy them. And when we celebrate it every year, we always recognize, as we do at Pesach, at Passover, we always recognize that the historical event we're celebrating also can give us great strength to recognize the miracles of the modern day. We say in Pesach, in Passover, that in every generation they rise up against us, but we prevail. And it's true also in our celebration of Purim, that when we celebrate Purim and we have our festive meal and we drink a l'chaim to the perseverance of the Jewish people, certainly those of us in Israel, and I believe those of us around the world who support and love Israel, recognize the relevance today and take great comfort and strength from the historical deliverance that we're celebrating, to recognize and to be optimistic about today that eventually this totalitarian, hateful, spiteful, dictatorial regime in Iran will be overthrown by its people, who are more interested in peace and in development and in democracy and freedom, and will eventually overthrow their leaders, that eventually Islamic State will be overthrown, will be defeated by the combined forces of the Western world, as well as the more moderate leadership in the Arab and Muslim world.
God willing.
And we can celebrate Purim and feel optimistic about our ability to overcome today's both persecutors and oppressors and haters, wherever they may be.
God willing, beautifully said. What's the mood in Israel right now, with what's going on in the world, with America? I know it's 2 Jews, 3 opinions, but go ahead and give us the zeitgeist.
We were talking earlier, and you mentioned and asked about the elections. I am not one to make predictions about elections, certainly not 4 weeks before they're held. As in any democracy, things can go in various different directions. People, certainly in Israel, go into the ballot box, though, go into the voting booth, with certain things on their minds. And yes, economic development is important. And yes, religious pluralism in Israel is important to many. And the health situation and housing prices are important to many. But at base, all of us in Israel are acutely aware that on our borders, in the north with Hezbollah, in the south with Hamas, and also in the south in the Sinai with various terrorist groups being active in the Egyptian Sinai, on the east in terms of the Islamic State, and they're taking over these territories in Iraq and Syria, and the probable introduction of Islamic State and Al-Qaeda forces to meet up with the Muslim Brotherhood, who are very powerful in Jordan, really on our eastern border, with the terrible incitement in the Palestinian Authority run by the Fatah party, Mahmoud Abbas, the supposedly moderate president of the Palestinian Authority, the incitement there calling for violence against Jews and against Israelis, and delegitimizing Israel's very existence, not only its presence in the territories. When we walk into the voting booth, we're acutely aware of the threats, both physical and intellectual, that are arrayed against us. And so the mood in Israel, which you're asking, I think will be reflected in the ballot box on March 17th. I think the parties which are stronger in terms of their willingness to stand up and face these threats, to acknowledge them, will end up, I think, forming the next government. That is my prediction, even though I don't like predictions. But I do want to close on a positive note. The mood in Israel is not at all neither scared, nor downtrodden, nor pessimistic. There is a lot of skepticism. Yes, skepticism towards any prospects for real peace with either the current Palestinian leadership, those Arabs of Judea and Samaria, or what's known as the disputed territories, the West Bank, governed by the Palestinian Authority. There's a lot of skepticism about the language coming out, as well as the intentions of the King of Jordan, the leaders of the supposedly moderate Arab states like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, and others. There's a lot of skepticism as to whether or not the Western world, led by America, is willing to stand up and take a stand and be as active as it needs to be against the Islamic State and others of its ilk in the region. So there's a lot of skepticism, but there's a lot of optimism too. You know, Peter, because you've visited there, and your listeners will know if they've either read widely enough or visited themselves. Israel is an incredibly vibrant, creative, dynamic society. And when you're living in Israel, you may, when you walk into the voting booth, be thinking about these issues of the Islamic State and the Iranian nuclear threat. But in your day-to-day life, it's amazing. It's a safe country. It's a country which is creative and vital and full of energy, and a wonderful place. I just want your listeners to know to visit and to come and explore, both in terms of the history, archaeology, the obviously religious nature, and yet also the wonderful secular party world of Tel Aviv. It's a wonderful place to live and raise your kids, and the mood in Israel is very positive, very optimistic, even though it's colored by this skepticism about any immediate prospects for peace in the region.
Beautiful. Now, before I get to the next question, how can people support your organization or follow you and know about what you're up to?
Thank you so much, Peter, for asking that. We have a website, of course, which is www.m as in media-central.org.
M-Central.
M-Central.org. And you can find out more on that website about what we do. And of course, we are a not-for-profit, and therefore donations are very gladly accepted. Our parent organization, Honest Reporting, I would encourage your subscribers who care about the challenges Israel faces in the media and care about how the media frequently distorts the reality on the ground. I would encourage everyone to subscribe at www.honestreporting.com. That's honestreporting.com, to our Israel Daily News Summary, which is a daily update of the news for people who are interested in what's going on in Israel, and to subscribe to our different communiques, which call on people to be active, taking their frustration when they turn on the news in the morning, not, of course, KDWN news, but turn on other radio news or turn on the television news or open their newspaper and get frustrated because the Israel they know and the reality that they're familiar with isn't reflected in the reporting. So to subscribe to Honest Reporting communiques gives you immediate access to facts and figures and the ability to write an email or a letter to the editor or a tweet that keeps the media on their toes to ensure that they're reporting accurately about Israel and about issues in the region.
In our final 2 minutes or so, tell us, what do you think, what single instance gives you the best satisfaction from your work, and a little bit what your typical day is like at Media Central in Jerusalem? Well,
at Media Central, we take journalists on field tours 2-3 times a week. We hold briefings 2-3 times a week. One good example, a week and a half ago before I traveled, we took a group of about 23 journalists, leading journalists from around the world, Asia, Europe, America, and elsewhere, up to the Golan to explore two of the issues that have been in the news recently: mortar fire across the border from Syria into the Israeli Golan, and the incident on the border at Har Dov near Rajar in the northern border with Lebanon with Hezbollah that had occurred just a day or two previously. And we helped the journalists with a few briefings, meetings with local residents who had been running into their shelters and what have you. And that's what we do. And we're able to help the journalists use accurate language to describe what's going on there on the ground.
Thank you for all your work. Mr. Aryeh Green, Media Central, and safe travels back to Israel. My love, all our love back to the people of Israel, the state of Israel. And next week, Rabbi, I want to be back, refreshed. Not skiing for the whole week. Well, okay, maybe skiing for most of it. And he'll be back, having seen his mother, his family. Join us back this time again next week. Thank you, Aryeh Green. And remember, as Rabbi Wine always says,
Great God in heaven, you know I love you.
Live your life joyfully.